so happy to have you here. Thank you so much for joining our annual Legislative 101 event. So our event tonight is called A Pathway to Prevention, Accountability, and Investment, because this year we are really focused on efforts to impact what has become a damaging and dangerous culture in the United States. A few housekeeping items before we get started. Please, I think everyone's microphone, or most people, you're already muted, but we're going to save questions for the very end. So please keep your microphone muted during the presentation. I'm going to go over some background and statistics and what we will be working on this legislative session. We'll spend some time talking about how you can get involved. And if you have questions along the way, I'm asking you to put those in the chat. Bonnie's going to help me monitor the chat. And if it's something that, she can answer there, she's going to go ahead and do that. And then at the end, we'll try to pull as much as we can from there and answer them accordingly. So again, this event is being recorded and we'll be sharing it out through our newsletter. If you're here tonight, I'm guessing you are already on that newsletter distribution list. But if you got here in any other way, I do ask that you go to our website. That's at mdpgv.org. Go to the Take Action tab and follow the instructions to sign up there. You can also make donations either to our education fund or our advocacy arm there as well. All right, so I'm just checking to make sure I don't have anybody sitting in the waiting room. So tonight we are talking about gun violence and what it is currently looking like in and around Maryland, and what sort of things really need to be happening in order to prevent gun violence, to hold the industry that has created this nightmare accountable, and to create pathways for that industry to offset the damage that they've done and are doing by paying for a variety of gun violence prevention work. So my name, which many of you already know this, my name is Karen Herron. I am the Executive Director at Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence. My story and what brings me to this space is not particularly unique. I was a young mom 11 years ago when the shooting at Sandy Hook Elementary School occurred. My own children were in 3rd and 1st grade at the time, so I very much saw the faces of them and their classmates in the faces of the 20 children who died that day. Over the years, I've connected frequently with other parents who, although they did not lose a child that day, have continued to mark every milestone that their similarly aged child passes through with the thought of those who did not get to do so. This year, my youngest child, the one that was in 1st grade at the time, I always get a little broken up at this part, is a senior in high school. The children killed in Newtown, Connecticut should be graduating from high school this year. But as impactful as that realization is, these children only represent a tiny fraction of the losses this country faces each and every year. Americans have lost over 395,000 souls to gun violence since Sandy Hook. That number does not include those injured or the myriads of folks damaged by every single one of those incidents, whether or not a death resulted. We are, in effect, a traumatized nation. And most of us here this evening either have a direct connection to gun violence or we know someone who has. And that is the American reality today. Many of you here tonight are already very familiar with the work that we do, but for those who are less so, we are the state level education and advocacy gun violence prevention group in Maryland. Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence has been around in some capacity for almost 40 years. Our founders initially organized back in the 1980s in order to pass legislation banning the cheap handgun that was impacting crime violence across the state. Like many who strive to make this world a better place, it was hoped that a long-term need for a state-level gun violence prevention group was not needed. Unfortunately, that is not the case. Only constant vigilance over our state gun laws, both to strengthen as well as to prevent bad laws from getting passed, will get us to where we would like to be in relation to gun violence. As we delve into the state legislative session slated to begin next week, I want to first take a moment to talk about the current state of gun violence here at home. Maryland, like many other states across the nation, faces the pressing issue of gun violence. The statistics are stark, and behind each number lies a story of tragedy and loss. Every incident is a reminder that we must come together to address this complex challenge. From urban centers to rural communities, gun violence touches lives indiscriminately, leaving families shattered and communities in distress. I'm going to start, though, with some good news. In 2022, violent crime decreased 8.5% in Maryland from the previous year, according to FBI data released in October. Nationally, violent crime was down slightly, about 1.7%. It also appears that 2023 final numbers for total gun violence deaths are down from somewhere around 44,500 in 2022 to 41,344 for 2023. So that reflects about a 7% decrease. It's critical to note that these decreases are being driven by states with strong gun laws, like Maryland. Increases in gun violence are being recorded, increases in gun violence are being recorded in states with weaker gun laws. And in fact, recently it was in the news that Baltimore recorded 262 murders in 2023. This is the first time in almost a decade that that number was below 300. And this coincided with a slight year-over-year decrease in non-fatal shootings. So this is wonderful news. That 300 number has been relentlessly stable in Baltimore. So this decline is a seriously good sign. But for 262 families, it is not enough. So as awful as this problem is, there is hope in that reflection, because make no mistake, it means that we can have an impact. It means, but obviously 262 families plus, those from around the state of Maryland, it's still far too many. So what is not going well? Where do we need to focus? The number of crimes committed with one or more guns was up 0.6%. Even more concerning, the profile of the victims has shifted significantly. In 2020, gun violence became the leading cause of death for American children. And in 2022, things got worse. Nationwide, the number of children killed in shootings increased by almost 12%. And those wounded increased by almost 11%. Gifford's Law Center to Prevent Gun Violence scores Maryland an A- for the strength of our gun laws. Generally, Maryland has enacted strong gun safety laws. That said, as part of a larger union, including many states with weaker laws, this means that far more crime guns are trafficked into Maryland than out of state. In 2022, Maryland imported crime guns from other states at the 4th highest rate in the nation. And the state imported more than 6 times as many crime guns than it exported. The theory here is that because Maryland's gun laws are strong, those trafficking in weapons have to bring them in from other states. And seriously, Maryland does a lot of things well. We have universal background checks, licensing, extreme risk protection orders. We have some domestic violence gun laws, assault weapons restrictions, large capacity magazine bans, strong concealed carry law, open carry restrictions, child access prevention, ghost gun regulations, location restrictions, investments in community violence intervention. But obviously, we still have gun violence. And the impact that states with weaker laws have on our population cannot be minimized. So what can we do to have a larger impact on what is going on? And that's really the focus of our legislative priorities for 2024. Let's take a moment to look at how we got where we are today. On your screen is a series of maps highlighting the issue of guns in public spaces. The gun industry has done an excellent job convincing the public that the wearing and carrying of firearms is a part of our nation's culture and history. And while certainly we have some history with firearms, as evidenced by the fact that the Second Amendment even exists, this idea that the country was one of a gun-toting populace is a lie. For many years of our history, little attention was paid to the Second Amendment just because gun carrying was simply not socially normal. The first map you see here is of 1980. 40 years ago, almost half the states in the Union did not allow any type of civilian carrying of guns in public. The states in blue reflect this. During that time, as highlighted by those states in green, the majority of states would issue permits for public carrying under certain conditions, but they retained the right to refuse. We sometimes referred to those states as may issue states. At that time, Vermont alone was an outlier in allowing public carrying without a permit, and 3 states were what we now call shall issue states, meaning that the state would issue a permit as long as objective standards were met. If you look below that map, you'll see the country in 1990. By this time, the landscape had really started to shift. You can already see that there are far fewer no-issue states and more shall-issue states. For frame of reference, what has become known as the Revolt of Cincinnati occurred in 1977. That event is largely viewed as the turning point of the National Rifle Association. Prior to 1977, the NRA had been planning to move its headquarters to Colorado to better focus its efforts on conservation and recreational shooting. After the revolt, those plans were scrapped. Leadership of the NRA increased funding for its lobbying arm, and they moved away from their support of incremental forms of gun control regulation and toward the protection of gun rights as their primary goal. What these maps really illustrate is how effective that long-term strategy has been for them. By 2017, Maryland was one of the few states managing to hold on to our may issue status. Once considered one of the more gun-friendly states, since in Maryland there was at least the possibility of a state granting a person a permit to carry in public, this framework had turned into one of the most restrictive until we reached the map of 2023. After the Supreme Court's Bruen decision in 2022, there are no longer any states where the state retains any subjective standards for whether or not to grant an individual a permit to carry a firearm into public spaces. All states are at least shall issue states, meaning if you complete the required steps and pass the necessary background checks, you must be granted a permit. Even more concerning is that this is not enough for the NRA. The states in orange in the 2023 map represent states that no longer have any permitting process. If you are legally allowed to own a gun in those states, then you can carry it into public spaces. No additional training, no oversight, nothing is required. This is the ultimate goal of the NRA. The NRA has effectively convinced people that gun culture is who we are as Americans. The author Rebecca Yarros wrote in her book, The Fourth Wing, an excellent read if you like sci-fi and fantasy, that it only takes one generation to change the text. One generation to teach that text, the next grows, and the lie becomes history. That is exactly what we see here. And it is time for us to take back that narrative. Which brings me finally to our legislative priorities for 2024. The title of our program tonight, A Path to Prevention, Accountability, and Investment, is because if we've learned nothing else from the NRA through this, is that we need to have concerted long-term goals that we are working toward. For many of us here, that is as simple as we want to see far less gun violence. But how do we get there? If things got worse as gun accessibility became normalized, how do we reverse that trend? And in particular, how do we do that when our Supreme Court has created new restrictions and tests that operate to damage the work that we've already done? We have done good work in Maryland addressing generally the accessibility of firearms. We have licensing, we have safe storage, we have a fairly high bar for public carry permitting, and we have an articulated list of places that are deemed too sensitive for firearms. But we do not have walls around our state, and we are surrounded by states with weaker laws and a federal government that has been incapable of reining in an ever-expanding Second Amendment. So this year, we are focusing on a longer-term strategy that has worked in other industries to improve their approaches to safety. We've outlined 3 key priorities that attempt to get to real prevention efforts and move us toward meaningful and long-lasting change. I'll list them all, and then I'll go back and fill in some detail. These include firearm industry accountability, advocating for responsible business practices within the firearm industry, holding manufacturers accountable for the impact of their products on public safety. Number 2, establishing a state-level office of gun violence prevention, creating a dedicated and centralized resource to coordinate efforts in preventing gun violence, enhancing collaboration among public health agencies, law enforcement, and community organizations. And number 3, comprehensive community safety funding, implementing a state excise tax on the profits the firearm industry receives from firearms, ammunition, and related products in order to generate funding for the state office mentioned, as well as a host of other gun violence prevention and community safety initiatives, ensuring sustainable financial support for initiatives aimed at reducing gun violence. As advocates, your involvement is crucial to the success of these initiatives. It is only through our collective effort, determination, and unity that we can drive positive change and build a safer future for Maryland. So let me go back and fill in some detail in relation to those top 3 priority items. First, gun industry accountability. Let me preface this conversation with the fact that this legislation requires another small history lesson. The Federal Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, often referred to as PLACA, is a federal law that was enacted in 2005 to shield gun manufacturers and dealers from civil litigation. While there are exceptions to this shield, PLACA has significantly restricted legal recourse for victims and communities affected by gun violence. So despite the enumerated exceptions, PLACA has effectively blocked most lawsuits against the industry. Since its enactment, very few cases have progressed to jury trials, leading to dismissals of potentially valid claims before they are even presented. And this matters for 2 critical reasons. One is that victims are denied justice through the legal system, even when there are clearly ways that the industry contributed to the death or injury of them or their loved one. And 2, we are a country that is built on this idea of democracy and that there are legal, non-violent ways to address problems. In particular, civil litigation has driven industries like the automotive industry, tobacco, and pharmaceuticals to adopt safer practices by exposing issues, shaping public opinion, and influencing legislation. Civil litigation is why cars now have seatbelts, airbags, anti-lock brakes, and why the auto industry is constantly evolving and adding new things to keep us safer on the road. My new car has a backup camera, a little beeping noise when I reverse, lane assist guiding my car back into the lane should I drift, blind spot indicators, and the list goes on. All of this is because we have set an expectation through our judicial system that we expect the automotive industry to do everything that they can to keep people alive in their products. We have none of this in the firearm industry. Instead of innovating towards safety, the firearm industry is protected from being held accountable. So they choose to innovate toward lethality. Their innovations include assault weapons and high-capacity magazines, Glock switches and auto sears, which convert firearms into those capable of automatic fire, bump stocks, rapid fire triggers, arm braces for more accuracy, folding guns to easily hide them, ghost guns, which are untraceable, and DIY silencer kits. We need the federal government to repeal PLACA. And one of the steps we need to get there is for more states to pass industry accountability laws at the state level. Doing so will provide a narrow pathway at the state level for victims to have their day in court, but it also sets the stage to eventually be able to get PLACA repealed. And we're here for the long game. Our next priority will create a state level office of gun violence prevention and intervention. We know that focusing all of our gun violence prevention efforts in and around the criminal justice system will not effectively end gun violence. Law enforcement is an important piece of the puzzle, but it is not the entire puzzle. Gun violence is a public health issue, and we need a structure that addresses it as such. A state-level entity would work to bring together stakeholders, enhancing collaboration among law enforcement, community organizations, and public health agencies to more effectively and efficiently work to prevent rather than just address gun violence. In addition to lives impacted, gun violence costs Maryland $10.5 billion each year. Around $383.9 million of this is paid by you, the taxpayers. Imagine if we put just a portion of this money into actually preventing gun violence in the first place. A state-level office can coordinate resources statewide and address gun violence in its various forms across counties, cities, and communities, however that looks. And this brings me to the third bill. To do this, we are urging lawmakers to take on adding a state-level excise tax to guns, ammo, and other firearm-related products. California did this recently, and honestly, it just makes sense. Proceeds from this tax could go directly to funding gun violence prevention. Since 1919, over 100 years, there has been a federal-level excise tax on firearm and ammunition retailers. For the last 86 of these years, this 10 to 11% tax has been used specifically to fund wildlife conservation efforts that remediate the effects that firearms and ammunition have on wildlife populations through game hunting. Let that sink in for a moment. For basically the last century, the gun industry has been paying to offset the harm their products do to wildlife, while simultaneously not doing so for the impact on human life. During this time, the firearm industry has enjoyed record growth and profits. A 2020 economic impact report by the Firearm Industry Trade Association, the National Shooting Sports Foundation, noted that the economic growth that America's firearm and ammunition industry has experienced in recent years has been nothing short of remarkable. A 2022 NSSF economic impact report said the same things and then documented a 269% increase in the firearm and ammunition industry's estimated economic impact from 2008 to 2021, and an 11% increase from 2020 to 2021 alone. This has coincided with an unprecedented spike in shootings and gun homicides across the United States. According to the CDC, from 2011 to 2021, the nationwide firearm homicide rate increased 85%. Firearms and ammunition sold by licensed manufacturers, dealers, and vendors of these products contribute to gun violence and broader harms. Gun dealers are the leading source of firearms trafficked to illegal markets, often through straw purchases as well as negligent losses. Taxing the firearm industry would place a reasonable cost on its members profiting from the sale of their products in order to generate sustained revenue for programs that are designed to remediate the devastating effects these products cause families and communities across the state. So those are our top 3 priorities. But before I move into questions, I'll also note a few other measures that we will be supporting. Number 1 of these additional measures is a bill to put guardrails on school shooter safety drills. This is implementing measures to ensure that safety drills in schools do not inadvertently cause harm or trauma to students, and striking a balance between preparedness and sensitivity to the psychological well-being of students. Number 2 is creating a voluntary do not sell list. So this would be establishing a voluntary list for individuals to self-identify and prevent themselves from being easily able to purchase firearms in moments of crisis. Empowering individuals to take proactive steps in the interest of personal and public safety. And lastly, though this other one is sort of spearheaded definitely through other organizations, we will be supporting this as well, which is an overhaul of Maryland's criminal injuries compensation system, or victim compensation. I won't get into all the details on that one because it is big and complicated, but ensuring that victims and their families receive assistance they need in the aftermath of gun violence is a critical first step in breaking cycles of gun violence that plague some of our most at-risk communities. And so that victim compensation piece is critically important. Okay, so I hope that this was helpful. I know that there are some missing pieces like bill numbers and in some cases sponsors. Some of that stuff will be finalized and announced in the coming weeks and will be included in information that we put out via fact sheets and newsletters. And I think I can stop sharing my screen now. I have more to say, but there we go. So I know, I'm not sure if Bonnie's done this yet, but if she hasn't, she will be doing it soon. She's going to be putting some documents in the chat that can be helpful to you, which will include tips for testifying, how to submit testimony, just sort of the basics of state advocacy in Maryland. And at the moment, we've got I'd say an early version of a gun industry accountability fact sheet, which is I think helpful and mostly complete, but there will be a few adjustments to it, specifically related to some recent news I found out about sponsors, and obviously once legislation gets actually introduced, we'll be able to put bill numbers and things like that on there. So be on the lookout for those. I will have fact sheets on the other pieces of legislation coming up as well, when some of those other pieces get solidified in terms of bill numbers and what have you. So those will be coming out as well. We are in the process of preparing some materials to help guide you in interacting with your legislators, if that is something that you would like to do. So we'll be putting information out about that. And I have a bunch of action items for you here, but I can also pause and start taking questions if we want to do it that way. Let me.
Erin, I have a couple of questions that came in to me. There was some questions about, if I call an email, does it really make a difference?
Yeah, absolutely. So the things that a lot of people don't understand about state legislature is that many of our legislators have very, very small staffs, especially on the House side of things. And they keep a tally on how many people reach out to them on any given bill and during session, and how many times and what they have to say about it. And it really actually doesn't take that many phone calls to be impactful, that many emails to be impactful. So yes, the answer is absolutely. I know it sometimes feels like you might be shouting into a void that nobody, you don't really get a response from, but they basically make a gauge, especially amongst their constituency. If they're getting, 10 calls that are for and 50 calls that are against any particular piece of legislation, then that's, that is something that they take into consideration. Certainly they have their own opinions about how things should play out or what have you, but they're not just going to fully ignore their own constituents, especially if they're getting you know, even just a few on a particular issue. So yes, it is absolutely impactful to be reaching out to your legislator. You don't necessarily have to do it a whole bunch of times. It just depends on sort of what is going on. I like to tell people to reach out early and let their legislators know that, you know, these are the things that we're looking at. We want to see these, like, for instance, you know, let's just say these 3 bills pass, and that letting them know that you're watching them and that you're keeping track, and that it's important to you. And then at some point during session, we will often, through Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence, we'll put out some more specific asks for you as time goes on that might be more specific to a particular piece of legislation, or maybe a particular legislator, or just the hearing committee. And that can vary widely based on just what is going on behind the scenes. But yes, it's definitely impactful.
Great, thank you. Ron is wondering about the gun industry immunity. Is there a sense that Congress has an appetite to work on legislation to repeal that?
I don't think we're there yet. I mean, you know, I don't think the federal government is close to that point at this moment. But that isn't to say, like, more and more states are actively passing these state level industry accountability bills. And that's important because the more that do it, the closer we get to the federal government being ready. So I won't pretend to think that our federal government is ready to repeal PLCAA. And that's why we're arguing for doing this at this moment, because we know that that is a longer term ask.
I have another one. People are wondering about virtual testimony in committees. Do you know if it's going to be in person or both this year?
I have not heard any updates yet. I don't have any reason to think that it will be different than last year. Although if we do hear that it will be different, then I will certainly let you know. For the most part, testimony is in person, but they will accommodate virtual testimony as well. And they were getting better at doing that. I think they do appreciate it when people show up in person, but it isn't necessary depending upon what you're bringing to the table and what you have to say. And they are getting better at accommodating those virtual testimonies. So if that's your preference, I think there's a wide acknowledgement that by having virtual testimony, they're able to pull from a constituent, from folks in geographic areas around the state that's a lot harder for them to get into Annapolis. And that's important that they're able to hear those voices. So I don't have any reason to think that it'll be different than last year, but if I do hear anything, I'll let you know. And last year you could do either one. You did have to choose, and you weren't really able to flip back and forth. So if when you went to sign up, you signed up as in person, they didn't usually want to change you to virtual unless there were some extraneous circumstances that really warranted it. But yes, I do think that will continue.
There's can you speak to some of the counter arguments to the tax bill in California?
The counter arguments to the tax bill? Yeah, I mean, I think they're the obvious ones. Obviously, the industry isn't going to want to tax they're going to end up, okay, so let me back up a little bit. This is not a sales tax. It is an excise tax, which means that it is a tax on industry profits. The industry gets to decide whether they're going to pass that on to the consumer or not. That's on them to make that decision. They technically do not have to do that. Most industries will ultimately pass those costs on to consumers. I'm not in denial about that, but that is up to them. And, you know, most industries will fight back against taxes of any sort on their products. That said, the firearm industry is unique in its position of creating a product that causes such massive amounts of harm throughout society. And so, you know, requiring there to be a way of offsetting those costs is obviously, I think, is rational. I'm guessing they won't think that's rational, but it is what it is.
We know California is a model that we can draw on for the tax bill. Are there models that you're using from other states for some of the other legislation?
Yeah, so yeah, California, we're definitely taking a look at what they did, and we're mirroring a lot of what they did, which is essentially we are bringing together a large coalition of folks that work in and around things that are related to gun violence prevention, and making sure that we're touching on different things in terms of where this money would ultimately go. But California was the first state to do that, and so they're really the only other place to look. Firearm industry accountability has been done, and I should know this number off the top of my head, and I just don't. It's been done in more than a handful of other states. The draft of because this is a repeat piece of legislation. Last year it was modeled after Delaware. I think there's some talk of it continuing to be modeled after Delaware, but Illinois has one that does essentially the same thing in a slightly different way. I believe New York has one as well. Like I said, it's more than a handful of states that have done it at this point. And sort of the advice from some of our national partners is that they've learned a little bit every time. And I think Delaware is sort of one of the more recent ones. And so they feel like that one's one of the better models to look at. But we are certainly looking at what has been done in other states. And then the state office, we are sort of behind the ball with the state office, I'll say. We've been working on this through the work that our organization does, coordinating a statewide violence prevention coalition, actively working on this since the end of session. But there are quite a few other states that have stood up offices to address gun violence at the state level in years past. Like Maryland is in no way on the forefront of getting this done. And yeah, so we have looked at what other states have done there. What we really want to see and what is most critical to us is that it is created in a way that recognizes gun violence as the public health emergency that it is. So some states have done that. They've put things within their, either their health department, and all states have their slightly different way that their state is organized at the government level. Some have done it within various either law enforcement or attorney general or that kind of thing. But we really emphasized in our conversations with folks in the governor's office that law enforcement is a critical piece of the puzzle. We need to make sure that they're in the conversation, but that continuing to fight gun violence with the tactics that we need to take in order to address once the violence has already happened isn't keeping things from happening. It's not keeping gun violence from happening. We really want to take a public health approach and position this within the Maryland Department of Health and the resources that they have within that department to be able to address this in a wider scope. So we've looked at what other states have done with their state offices and sort of compared and contrasted. And as most of you may already know, even the federal government, President Biden recently stood up a federal level office, White House Office of Gun Violence Prevention. And one of the deputy directors there, Greg Jackson, is someone we've worked closely with within our coalition, and to help sort of organize and position around this idea of a state level office.
Great, thanks, Karen. Someone is asking about if this is the first year for the tax bill here in Maryland, and it is. What about the importing of guns into the state? What are you considering doing for that?
Yeah, so it's, when I assume you're sort of talking about the trafficking of guns from out of state into our state because it's harder for folks to get hold of things. We already have laws that are around, centered around gun trafficking and all of those types of things. I'm not trying to say that we don't need to take another look at them or see if they need to be stronger or what have you. But we can't change the state laws of other states. We don't have that power to do that, to make other states make sure that they have licensing and background checks. Because as much as some of those things seem like, oh, doesn't everybody have that? Not all states even require folks to do anything other than that simple federal background check. Like we have licensing in the state of Maryland, what we call handgun qualification license. Other states don't have that. We've had that for at least 10 years. So it's a lot easier for folks to get firearms in other states. And I think, I know it's harder to see by going after the industry through things like gun industry accountability and making them have to pay for the impact that gun violence has. That's how we get to that trafficking piece. That's how we helped them, force them to create mechanisms within their systems that prevent straw purchases, that prevent gun trafficking, that make firearm dealers be held to high standards that they aren't always held to, depending upon where they are. And it's harder to see because it'll be a longer time to get there. But until we hold the industry accountable for the harm that they're doing, not only in Maryland, but everywhere else, we're not going to get to that place. And so that's kind of why we're looking at it the way we are at the moment. I think that makes sense. I hope that makes sense. I know it's not, we all wish that there was a piece of legislation that we'd pass and that would like completely clean up the mess. But we've been working in this space for long enough to know that that's just not how this works. It took, you saw those maps, you see how long it took the NRA to completely shift the landscape of what carrying guns in public looks like in the United States. We have to look at it the way that they did. Like, it can take us 10 or 20 years to get to a final place. We're making progress. We're seeing that in some of the numbers that are creeping out now. Our numbers were so high, though, that it's still atrocious where we are. So we just have to keep doing that. But I hope that makes sense to folks, that the way that I'm looking at things.
Great, Karen. That's all the questions you've got at the moment. I'm getting ready to post again a link to the Victims Access to Justice fact sheet. And just noting that the sponsors have changed. I don't know whether you want to talk a little bit about how that happens.
Yeah, so just note that session doesn't start until next week. So that means that like everything I told you tonight, it's accurate as I can make it tonight. I in the past couple of days, I'm putting together some of and fine tuning this presentation. I've been doing some outreach, thinking I was just going to get a yes, it's the same kind of answer from legislators, only to find out that certain things had already shifted. New sponsors were being noted, or people were taking on some of these things that are, haven't been announced yet, or that we have to wait on, or what have you, or names have been changed. So just know that like this is fairly accurate. It's definitely accurate as of right now. But that we'll be putting out information sheets and more information through our newsletter, and posting documents on our website that you will be able to use and print out if that is useful to you. And things change, and just be aware that may in fact be the case. So I'll give it a few more minutes, and I'll go over some of the things I have in my sort of keep this on your radar for action items thing. And if you think of any other questions and you want to ask, please feel free to do so. So I think I've said this earlier, make sure you've signed up for our newsletter. Go to our website at mdpgv.org, click on Take Action, and then the button to sign up for our newsletter is there. And as we roll new documents out, they will be shared through our newsletter. If you are looking for them on your own, I will also be posting them on our website. So from our website, if you go to the resources tab, you'll look for the 2024 legislative resources folder. And that's where all the documents Bonnie was sharing tonight are. And we'll be able to find updated versions or new documents put in there as we get them put together. The next thing I will say is to make sure you know who your legislators are and what committees they sit on. This is a somewhat unusual year. We don't know committee assignments yet. We have a guess at where these things are going to end up being. And I was just on a call earlier today where I thought I was like totally sure I knew where something was going to go. And then this other person was like, no, I think it'll go here. And so who knows? But just know that we often end up with our bills in front of judiciary and JPR. That may end up being the case again this year, but there's a very high chance that some of these bills are going to end up in different committees, which I'm actually kind of really excited about. Health and government operations, finance, tax and budget, that kind of thing. So if you're I know we end up with a lot of Montgomery County folks, and they have some great people who are on judiciary and JPR. But people from other parts of the state might actually be critically important this year as well, especially if we end up in different committees. So know who your legislators are, what committees they're assigned with, because depending upon where these bills end up, they could become critically important for purposes of that sort of hearing stage of things. If you are interested in asking for a meeting with your legislator about these bills, you are more likely to be successful if you're asking your own legislator. I know some of our groups end up organizing like a larger group of folks, maybe through their synagogue or a religious organization or social group that they're working with. As long as you've got one or two folks who are from that legislator's district, it's probably a good enough way to pull them into a meeting. They will often take virtual meetings. If you want to go to Annapolis, they will usually take an in-person meeting as well. So if you're interested in that kind of thing, we're trying to make sure that you're supplied with stuff that can help you out. Know that you don't have to be an absolute expert on any of these things to be impactful and to have a voice in talking to your legislator. That you don't have to know all the ins and outs of every nuance, every argument for and against any particular piece of legislation. They just need to hear from you. That is impactful enough. We do ask, I have some volunteers this year who are going to help me out with this. We do ask that if you've done if you do any of that outreach, let us know how it went. Certainly let us know if you think that particular legislator could benefit from us following up with them. We're going to be trying to do all of that outreach ourselves, but certainly you might have a conversation where you're like, that person's on the fence, but I think you could help. Let us know that, because that's something that would be really helpful and impactful. So we're going to try to keep a handle on how effective and how wide ranging the outreach is. So we would love it if you'd report back to us. So be on the lookout for, sort of instructions on how to do that. And like I said, in addition to updating the documents that are currently on the website, we'll have fact sheets for all of the legislation that we talked about here tonight. So as soon as I can get this put together, I ended up with COVID over the holidays. So some of the things that I thought I was going to manage to get done by today just did not happen. So I apologize, but it will, I promise. And then let me see if there was anything else.
Yeah.
Oh, one more thing. We will periodically put out what we call calls to action. So you can be on the lookout for that kind of thing. Those are what that is it's on a platform that we host that will provide you some instructions on how to kind of quickly reach your legislator. You'll be asked to put in some, if your personal details in terms of location, so that it can identify who your legislator is automatically. You don't have to do that part. We save those to use only at sort of critical junctures. So we don't use those frequently. I know some organizations will use those very frequent. I think they're a little less impactful if you do them too much. So just be on the lookout for anything that we kind of call a call to action. Because at that stage, it means that we're really, really trying to get somebody's attention for some particular reason. And that changes from session to session as to what that is. So that is, I think that's the last thing that I wanted to point out. And with that, is there any other questions?
Two more, Karen. So sometimes people, they're asking about when they see a ton of people testifying for the gun lobby or for other groups, and we don't have a ton of people testifying. What is what is the strategy, or why is that sometimes?
Yeah, so I will say that I think we have gotten much better, like, and I say we as in Marylanders to Prevent Gun Violence, at being able to have conversations with legislators. I don't want to say behind the scenes, but like where they're reaching out to us for our insight and opinions on things. And it has become important over the years to make sure that we are not creating a scenario where their job is harder than it already is. So we always encourage folks to submit testimony. In certain situations, it's certainly okay to actually give oral testimony. But when you just have person after person after person show up and say, I'm not trying to figure out how to say this diplomatically. Sometimes it's less impactful to be bombarded with all the stories that, especially the gun rights folks, will bring to the table. So it's a balance, right? Like those hearings, especially when they happen in judiciary and JPR, they can often go 11, 12, 1 o'clock in the morning. So having a room full of people say the exact same thing isn't always super helpful. I know I'm not articulating this very well, but we want to try to be as professional as possible. We want to give them information that they don't already have in some other way. And if and they need to know as a constituent if you support or don't support a particular piece of legislation. But if you're not necessarily bringing something they wouldn't otherwise know to the table, then oral testimony doesn't always make sense. But that's a call that you can't, we try to let you guys make that call for yourself. But certainly if you have a question and you want my opinion, reach out to me and ask me. I'm happy to give it. But we are a democracy. You have a right to go and say whatever you want to say to the legislators. I think that's a fantastic part. And, it's very different at the state level than it is at the federal level, because at the state level, you actually can go do those things. I don't know that our federal legislators necessarily want to hear anything any of us have to say ever, but maybe, I don't know.
Great, thanks. And then there was also a question about focusing on ammo, about the manufacture and distribution of ammunition. Is that something that is being considered?
Are you talking about the tax?
I believe that it's a wider question than the tax.
So we don't have any legislation that we are actively working on this session that is directly dealing with any particular type of firearm or ammunition. We have been looking at we have an assault weapons ban in the state of Maryland. And it's not bad, but I will say that the gun industry has learned how to create around it. And so we have been and are actively looking at what might need to change, but there's also a lot of ongoing litigation right now. And so kind of reading the political tea leaves, we kind of have to wait and see some of that stuff play out in the court system while we're simultaneously carefully analyzing sort of what that is and what it's doing. So someday in the future, next year, the year after, are we going to come back and take a look at it? Possibly. It's just not ripe yet. So that's kind of where we are with that. Any other questions, Bonnie?
I think that's all. Thank you.
Oh, excellent. Okay. All right. Well, I guess I mean, we are actually almost at the hour. So that is basically what we have time for this evening. Thank you. Special thanks for Bonnie for all the help with tonight's program and just generally with everything that she does to help keep things running. And thanks all of you for taking times out of your busy lives to attend this evening. You really are the ones that put the pressure on our legislators to act. So keep doing that. Let me know if you've got questions. Reach out to me if we didn't answer something tonight that comes up. Let me know. You can email us at info@mdpgv.org. And I hope to see some of you in Annapolis. And, again, please let me know if there's something that you need from us that we can help make your advocacy efforts better and stronger. That's what we're here for. So happy to do that. And I'm really thankful for all of you.
Yay.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Night.